Hey, what's up, YouTube, and welcome to my review of Batman Gotham City Chronicles by Monolith Games. If you are new to the channel, I would point out that this review might be slightly different than other board game reviews you may have tuned into on YouTube, and the main difference here is I'm coming more from a dedicated miniature gamer side. And what that means is I'm going to be spending a little bit more time and scrutiny on reviewing the miniatures themselves, as well as painting and how to approach painting a large project like this. So that's something to bear in mind. There will probably be less of an emphasis on mechanics, although I will talk about that quite a bit. But it's also going to be framed in the framework of reviewing that against, say, miniature skirmish games, a little bit more so than board games. While, yes, I do play board games, I do focus mainly on board games that include miniatures that are to be painted, and I always paint those miniatures before I play them and review the board games holistically around both hobby and gameplay aspects. So that is one thing that is going to be different for new viewers of this channel. This is going to be a slightly different perspective on the Batman board game. But for those of you who are regulars to the channel, this should be nothing new. So let's move on to the review proper. Okay, so Batman Gotham City Chronicles is a game by Monolith Games. This game plays up to 4 players. It's a semi-cooperative game. You usually have 1 to 3 players controlling the heroes versus 1 player that is controlling all of the bad guys. That player is the villain. That's the typical story mode. There is also a versus mode and some expansions. I'm not going to be covering the expansion so much or the versus mode in terms of this review because as of right now, I have not played the versus mode yet. My current progress in this game is I've painted a little over 75% of the miniatures in the core game. There's about 160-ish miniatures in the core game, and then there's 20-something scenarios, and I've played the game around half a dozen times right now. So bear in mind, this is my impression of the game after about a half dozen plays and painting through most of the core set. So in Batman Gotham City Chronicles, this is all the story mode is determined by scenario. So what you normally do is you will select the scenario you want to play, set that up on the board, and begin to play it. Now, the first thing I will say is this game has a ton of components, and setup is fairly long, especially if it's your first few times playing. It's going to be longer actually than the game sometimes. The first time I played it, it took me longer to set up the game and then take it down. That time combined was longer than the actual game time. The actual game time is actually not terribly long. It's only typically about an hour and change. Sometimes it can go faster than that. That's because the games play pretty quick. They're usually around 6 or 7 turns per game, and a game turn goes pretty fast. So one of the key mechanics of the game is this resource management aspect, which what you do is you get a bunch of energy cubes, whether or not you're the hero or the villain, but typically this is best explained with the hero. So you have a set of energy cubes that you're going to be moving around your little control panel through between active and fatigued areas of that board, and then there are also wound areas. And essentially, it's a resource management thing, right? So you're going to spend those cubes to make attacks, to make additional movements, to try to do manipulations or complex thought processes. And that mechanic is fairly straightforward, and it's actually a pretty nice little slick mechanic. For those of you who are used to the Knight models, Batman miniatures game, it's not terribly dissimilar to that. So in that game, you're allocating essentially counters, or most people just use dice. You allocate counters to your attack, your defense, your movement, and that kind of thing. that's not terribly different than what you're doing here if you're playing the heroes. So you have that core resource mechanic, and then the villain has a similar mechanic to that, but instead of just buying individual actions for one hero, they're actually managing a pool of villains along a track that we call a river, and that river scales in order of how expensive it is to activate models along that river. So the deeper that card is along the river, the more expensive it is to activate that card, which then activates the unit. So at its heart, it's a pretty simple game mechanically. You define your scenario, and then within your scenario, you have your set win conditions for both the hero and the villain. And the heroes will get a pool of heroes that they select for their first, second, and third hero. So there's quite a bit of balancing that occurs there when you're selecting heroes. The villain does not really get to choose um, what types of thugs and what main bad guy they're playing. That is entirely assigned by the scenario. So there is a lot of balancing that goes into the scenarios, and so you kind of play the scenario as defined in the book, and then you set up your game and you play it. And like I said, at its heart, it's a very simple game. That said, I think where this game really struggles is in how to communicate some of the simple things. And then there are just things that are actually way more difficult than they need to be. And you'll hear this in a lot of like the standard game reviews. A lot of the game reviewers really bash that rulebook by Monolith. Monolith, they write a rulebook that I'm not really sure who it's for, because navigating that rulebook is fairly horrendous. There's no index. The sections are very wordy, and in order to find specific things or specific rules, you have to just dig through swathes of text. So it's quite a bit of work to figure out how to play the game. In fact, I don't even think I would be able to play the game had I not sat down with some other people that had already played the game. I probably wouldn't have had the patience to navigate all the way through the rule book. So that's probably the biggest ding to the game, is the rule book. And then there's this really interesting thing with Monolith really wanting the game to be language agnostic. And what I mean by that is you'll see this design in games like Ghost Stories and that kind of stuff, where it's really pretty slick in how the game communicates through symbols as opposed to having written text on things. So that design carries here through the Monolith game, the Batman game. And the issue here is that individual characters and individual actions have so much complexity to them that no, it's language agnostic, but yes, you kind of have to learn a different language entirely. Like, you have to learn the symbol language of the game. And so okay, it's equal in that it's language agnostic, but now nobody knows what language this is, and everybody has to spend time learning the symbol language. And that is probably the single biggest ding against the game. Is it is it's written essentially in hieroglyphics. It's written in a language that nobody understands, and then to top it off, it's in order to understand it, you have to read through a rule book, which is just excruciating to get through. But here's the good news with all that. The good news is, once you do start to decode this language and start to play the game is pretty slick and it's pretty fast. At the end of the day, it's still a dice chucker with a bunch of modifiers that you decode on your sensor. And running in tandem with that is this resources energy mechanic, which can make the games very exciting. And with the limited amount of turns that you have. There is a lot of fun just sort of baked into the game. It's actually a super, super fun game. Without the Batman skin, though, it's very difficult to tell whether or not this would be a fun game, or I would definitely say it's not worth painting 160 miniatures if it's not for a theme that you strongly, strongly love. If it was just like, hey, random space guys, then probably I would not sit through painting that many miniatures. Because it's Batman, yes, I'm going to paint all my favorite Batman characters, my favorite Batman villains, and it's going to be awesome. There are going to be thugs in the game, and there are quite a few of those. Now, I'm kind of a mixed opinion here, because while the thugs are extremely nice quality, the sculpts themselves are rather fantastic. They're I would say they're in the good to very good range of board game miniature pieces. Not quite on the excellent scale, which is some other games I'm thinking about do have miniature sculpts, single piece plastic sculpts that fall in the excellent range. So I'm not just talking about Kingdom Death or something like that. This lands in the very good to very good scale. My ding against the miniatures here is probably the bases. Have a tendency to get warped. They're extremely thin, and so a lot of the bases that you will get are warped. You can fix those, but you'd have to take a heat gun or something to it and like bend them back, reform them. I haven't done that with mine. I'm just gonna live with it. Though I probably would recommend you do something different. So the miniature components are very good. They're great to paint because they're superheroes. So it's not a lot of it's not like 12 colors to a miniature or anything like that. And with a few exceptions, the miniatures aren't incredibly tedious to paint. In other words, it's just like a few colors. You use a lot of blending. You can use some highlighting, but you're not like picking out endless amounts of detail, right? You're not painting 32 belts. You're not doing endless bordering, like gold bordering around bright red interior that you might get in some other miniatures games. You're getting really nice superheroes. So you can paint some dark colors, some deep colors, some bright colors. And if you do your homework with the zenithal priming, and coming up, you're going to be able to do a lot more with Citadel contrast paints. It's a very fun range to paint. I've enjoyed a lot of the sculpts in here, particularly things like normal things like bystanders I like, and some of the more plain looking characters are sculpted so well that I enjoy those as well. I particularly like the Katana and Black Canary sculpts because they're better, in my opinion, than the Night Models analogs. Though I would say, any character in this game that you don't really like the sculpt of, well, guess what? They're the same scale as Night Models, and if you want something really nice, and this game is base size agnostic, go ahead and take that Night Models piece that you want to field and use that as your piece. It's another nice little bonus here. So if you're one of those folks that wants to play pretty quickly, but you also want to enjoy the best pieces painted, you may only paint the heroes. But even then, in that case, the core set of heroes is still going to take you somewhere in the area of around 60 ish miniatures, maybe even closer to 100 if you're going to paint all of the main villains as well. So it's quite a bit of painting, but again, that really hinges on your enjoyment of Batman and your enthusiasm about the world of Gotham. That said, it's a fairly fun experience, but it can get a little grueling at times. Just the sheer amount of miniatures can get rather grueling. So really, where does the experience lie in this game, and where do I end up in terms of rating the game? So to back it all up again and start from the beginning, we're talking about a game that if you're a hobbyist or painter, It's excellent value for the sheer number of miniatures you're going to get. They are useful. You can use those miniatures in the Night Models game, but you're going to need the cards for that game as well. Just bear that in mind. But you're going to have to do an awful lot of painting to really play it painted here. That's a lot of work. Then you're going to have to get through that rule book or get somebody to sit down and show you how to play. I'm considering putting together my version of here's how to play Batman Gotham City Chronicles, because I watched some other ones online and they helped a bit, but I think we may even be able to simplify it further, because at the end of the day, this is a fairly simple game. I mean, my son and I play it. He's 5. And as long as you boil it down to a few decisions for him, you teach him how to count the symbols on the dice and that kind of thing, he's good to go. So that should say something. This game it's complex in how long it's going to take you to learn it, but it's fairly simple and even elegant in some places in how it really plays out. So in terms of looking at this game, there is going to be some significant upfront expenditures. One, the game was on Kickstarter for not cheap. I mean, it's a great value, again, for miniature collectors and painters. It's a tremendous value, but it's still a significant amount of money nonetheless. So board gamers might be turned off by the initial price tag. Then you have another expenditure of energy in terms of painting enough miniatures to play the first scenario. I think you end up painting something like 50 plus miniatures just to play the first scenario and have all the options for heroes available. So you're gonna that's gonna be at least a couple of batches to paint. I think I painted 2 batches, and then a set of heroes to get to that point. Then you're gonna have to go through the energy of having to learn the game with a very difficult rule book and some quirky rules, and then lots and lots of symbols and traits to learn. So significant energy expenditure on your part up front. But is it worth it? I'm going to just come out here and say, as a fan of Batman, if you're a fan of Batman, it's absolutely worth it. And I say that specifically to the miniature gamers. Miniature gamers are used to making this sort of cost-benefit analysis, right? They're used to making this level of value judgment, especially 40K players that play it painted. Not all of them do, but the ones that do understand that, hey, if you're going to get into a brand new army, there is a lot of painting that they have to do. And that painting is, in my opinion, that's way more tedious than the painting here. Then they have to get a codex and learn all their armies, rules, and ins and outs and that kind of thing. So it's similar in that regard. There's a significant expenditure up front, but once you get past those hurdles, once you get past the price, and then the batch painting, and then the horrendous rulebook, and you actually understand what this game is, things move pretty slick, pretty smooth, right? You also have the minor annoyance of having to carry around 2 gigantic boxes if you want to play this game in public, and I do that, and I'm not a fan of it, but hey, I got a decent-sized trunk, and I'm used to carrying miniatures, so that's fine too. But then you've got another hurdle in terms of setting up the game, and it usually takes a good 20 to 30 minutes when you're first starting to learn how to set up the game and read your scenario and do all the whatnot there. So then you're all set up and you start your game, and that's where things go really nicely downhill, right? Because not like bad downhill, but like you just start smooth sailing from there, because the game itself at its heart is very slick. Once you get the traits down, and I strongly recommend printing out the listed traits on Board Game Geek and using that, then it's a very slick game. It's a very fun experience. So I would actually recommend it once you can get past all of those hurdles that I talked about before. So at the end of the day, that's the cost benefit that you have to weigh in on your mind. For you miniature gamers, Think about this like you're starting a brand new 40k army or something like that, or you're playing, you're jumping from a skirmish game to a larger style game. That's kind of the energy expenditure, the value and benefit that you have to weigh out in your mind. Like I said, though, the game itself, once you start playing, it plays in about an hour or less, and it's pretty slick once you've got your timing down. I strongly recommend this type of game for, say, a group of 3 to 4 players. If you have your regular gaming group or your regular group that you play miniatures with, this game is going to roll pretty smoothly with them after the first few games. And I think that's a universal recommendation with this game is you really need to play this a few times and kind of get used to it. This game has got quite a big barrier of entry, but overall, it's still a very fun experience. So I am going to recommend this game. I want to thank everyone for watching this video. And guys, stay tuned for my how to play. I'll do my best at trying to explain it. Thanks a lot, and we'll catch you on the next one.